So this talk hopefully will give you hope about this energy transition that we need to go through. That's a theme of so many of the presentations that you've heard so far at the conference. And this grows out of an interest in using the past to understand how to make a way to a better future. And let me also say that I'm grateful to the organizers for having me. So if we look at how we might go to a net zero sustainable future, well, we need to get there in pieces. We're shooting for a 50% reduction by 2030. That's obviously not going to happen in the United States or in many parts of the world. And that we should be approaching net zero by 2040 if we want to circumvent the worst outcomes of climate change. The big question is how, and the line here in the middle shows you how big the challenge is in the United States. In 2023, the last year for which we have data, the current administration has not released data from 2024, we consumed 233 billion gallons of fuel. That's an enormous amount of fuel to try and replace an enormous amount that right now mostly comes from petroleum. So what do we do? And I'm going to put on my timer to remind myself to stay on time. There we go. So how? Well, again, we can learn some lessons from the past, and that'll be part of what I'll cover this morning. Okay, so what must we do? Well, we must replace the fossil energy that we've been consuming, which is basically an interruption of the biogenic carbon cycle. In the biogenic carbon cycle, we have plants doing photosynthesis. Those plants are eaten by animals, and then those animals are eaten by other animals. All of us end up as dead organisms. And in certain unique circumstances in the history of the planet Earth, some of this biomass got sequestered and became the fossil fuels, an enormous reservoir of carbon. And we've been digging that out at an incredible rate all around the world and adding back carbon to the atmosphere that has been locked away for 30 to 300 million years. What we'd like to do is move to something that looks more like the biogenic carbon cycle, where we're taking CO2 from the air through plants or through direct air capture or by capturing CO2 at the uses of fuel at point sources and turning it back into fuel. Long term, that's what we must do, in addition to eventually removing some of the excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to get back to maybe 350 part per million. So how do we do that? Well, we need to be mimicking Mother Nature and using the biogenic carbon cycle to create a kind of anthropogenic carbon cycle, a human-driven carbon cycle. There we go. So in the US and some of the world, we've been focused on vehicle electrification. We've started to have regulations in certain parts of the world, like California, that seem to indicate that engines are going to be banned, that engines are bad. Well, as I explained in our lecture yesterday on the future of the IC engine, engines aren't the problem. What we feed the engines is the problem, fossil-based fuels. And now we have many choices we can make in electric vehicles. I'm driving an electric vehicle now because it was at a very good price, and it's actually a wonderful car. And even companies like Hertz were, for a time, renting electric vehicles. So imagine going to the city of San Francisco, California. You don't know the city, and you pick up an electric vehicle. Where are you going to charge? You might not even know your way around. So unless you had an app that could tell you where to charge, that might be a real problem and not a good idea. So yes, the emphasis on electrification is perhaps too heavy. And in the US, it seems that consumers have signaled to industry that we need to go to something in between. And maybe there'll be more plug-in hybrids, which act like an electric vehicle, but give you the unlimited range you might need on certain days. And that fits into the previous administration's blueprint for a future transportation strategy and how to decarbonize. We want convenience, otherwise consumers will not buy those vehicles. We need efficiency to use whatever low carbon energy we have as efficiently as possible. And it needs to be clean. It needs to be low carbon. It needs to lead to lower emissions from engines. Um, and in the final draft of this document from the Biden administration, they did end up adding a lot more emphasis on sustainable liquid fuels, which I thought was a good idea. All they have been talking about in the early years of the Biden administration is electric cars. Electric cars will solve all our problems, and clearly that's not true, or will ramp up hydrogen. And while I'm very interested in hydrogen and I'm leading co-coordinating a hydrogen alliance for North America with a colleague at the University of California, Riverside, hydrogen is going to take a long time to make much of an impact on our carbon emissions. So where we need to focus is sustainable fuels, mostly biofuels in the near term. Okay, so in the US, we've had for more than 20 years an idea that we could produce something like 1 billion tons of biomass. 1 billion tons of biomass could turn into a lot of fuel. And we could, that billion-ton study that the federal government has done, the Department of Energy leading that, the idea is we'll do this sustainably, so we can do it all into the future, ad infinitum. And from that, we could potentially get maybe 70 billion. The newest number now is 73 billion gallons of fuel. So if we look at transportation, we use 233 billion gallons of gasoline equivalent between gasoline, jet fuel, and diesel fuel. That if you take that and turn it into quadrillions of BTUs, that's nearly 28 quads. A quadrillion BTU is a 10 to the 15th BTUs. That's a convenient number, a quad, to describe US energy consumption. We use a bit over 90 quads a year across all forms of energy. I'll come back to that idea here in a minute. But we right now consume about 9% of our total energy as renewable energy. In the transportation fuels area, maybe we can make 73 billion gallons of fuel. We could replace about 1/3 of what we need with biofuel sustainably. So in that billion-ton study, go back. There we go. Okay. In that billion-ton study, they've looked at the different sources of biomass. This is where they've got this new number. So this report, the billion-ton study, was updated in 2023. We think now we can make 1.3 billion tons of biomass from a variety of different sources. The report, you can later look at this QR code and get the detailed report. Hopefully it's still there. Current administration's been deleting reports on climate change and other things. But again, let's take a long view. Things will get better. They're bad right now, but they'll get better. And so this could be used perhaps, well, it needs to be used to cover aviation fuel. We're not going to be riding around in hydrogen-powered planes anytime soon. We looked at that during the Reagan administration. My father worked on a project related to that. It's not a good idea. So for aviation, we need liquid fuels from biomass or synthetic fuels. And off-road and rail, those may be hard to operate on electric or on other, so they may need these biofuels. And we're gonna need some of this for on-road, for long-haul trucks. So how this fuel will get used will be a matter of which has the highest priority. Decarbonizing aviation right now is a big priority in the United States. So a lot of that biomass is going to go to making sustainable aviation fuel. Okay, and if we look at how we might make this fuel, well, we'll continue in the US to rely on corn and oils from plants like soybean and canola, and maybe winter cover crops like covercress or Brassica carinata. We will make ethanol, we will make biodiesel and renewable diesel, fuels we're familiar with. And generally we need to make fuels that we're familiar with because the fuels have to meet codes and standards, or else they're going to have problems in the engines that we drive, in the vehicles that we drive. And so another thing that we see in the evolution of our biofuel and replacement fuels is many of these fuels aren't like the fuels we use today, and that's going to create some challenges, which means there's a lot of engineering left to do in internal combustion engines and low carbon fuels. We're far from done, and there's a lot of great discoveries to be made. Sorry, let's go back. Yeah, so our current biofuel production as of 2023 looks like this. We made just shy of 16 billion gallons of ethanol, 1.6 billion gallons of biodiesel, and 1.5 billion gallons of renewable diesel. Renewable diesel is also referred to as hydrodeoxygenated vegetable oil, HVO, and this number is changing dramatically. This is a great fit for decarbonizing a fleet of trucks or a transit fleet. And the demand for this fuel is growing, and the production capacity to make it, as I'll show you in a moment, is growing rapidly. And we'll look at some of the latest data that's available. Okay, so renewable diesel, and this is direct from tables that are produced by the federal government, from the Energy Information Agency, showed in 2022, we made 18 billion gallons, almost 17 plus of ethanol, 2.2 of biodiesel. We had the production capacity to make this much, and 1.5 of renewable diesel. And I saw a report in 2022 as I was working on a book chapter that said this is going to increase from 500 million gallons a year in 2019 up to 5 billion gallons a year by 2024, end of 2024. But there's no way. Well, in fact, in January 2025, we got to 4.5 billion gallons a year of renewable diesel production capacity. There's so much pull for this in California, where they have to meet the requirements of the low carbon fuel standard, that there's a big pull. It makes it hard to get this fuel in my state, where I live, Michigan. So our transit system, which I've worked with, we've run a bus and other things on renewable diesel. Our fleet managers have said we can't count on getting the fuel, so we're not going to bother. But it worked great. It's a drop-in replacement, and so that's why there's so much demand for it. And so this is explosive growth in capacity. And we've reached something like 25 billion gallons total of biofuel. That's only 10% or so of what we need, but it's a lot more than we were making just 10 years ago. So things are improving. So as I mentioned, I had to write a book chapter. I was asked to contribute a chapter on the reciprocating engines to a book being put together on renewable fuels, sources, conversion, and utilization. And this was at the sort of tail end of the pandemic, so I had a lot of time sitting alone in my office, and I really dug into this. I had a lot of fun with it. And it caused me to want to go back and look at the history of the IC engine and the history of fuel production. So if we think about the United States, just 200 years ago, in the 1800s, how did people get around? Well, horses and other animals. Horse-drawn carriages or riding horses directly, mules pulling barges along the Erie Canal or other waterways that were man-made or natural throughout the United States. We relied on animals, and the animals are fed biomass. They're indirect bioenergy conversion systems. It's one way to look at it. But then in the 1800s, later, we started producing large amounts of coal. We're the Saudi Arabia of coal, the United States and China. We're both the Saudi Arabia of coal. We have 25% of the world's coal, as does China. So we became big coal producers, and we moved to coal-fired steam locomotives. This is one that you can still ride today in Steamtown National Park in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where clothes that aren't your favorite, you'll get covered with cinders, as people used to, I guess, when they rode these trains back in the day. And what this is based on is a kind of inefficient fire tube type of combustion chamber. Well, lo and behold, in the basement of the auto lab, we had a fire tube steam generator. And I thought they were going to replace this with a turbine or something. No, they just put a natural gas fired burner on it. And we still heat our building with this old fire tube burner. The fire goes through the tubes and the water is around the outside, like a shell and tube heat exchanger. Very inefficient, but it works. And then this is another image that I dug up. This is a person that was shoveling coal into the coal-fired boilers that ran the Titanic. If anybody's a fan of the Titanic movie or the Celine Dion music from it. Well, there was a scene where there was a tryst, some romance, and a little car that was down in the hold of the Titanic. And in the background, you'll notice there's the guy shoveling coal. I noticed that. Probably everyone else is focused on the romance, but I found that interesting. Another thing, so I was with my wife in Paris in June. We were on our way to Germany for a conference. And we're walking through the Musée d'Orsay, which has a lot of Impressionist art. And so there was paintings by Claude Monet, Vincent van Gogh. There was an exhibition on posters from the late 1800s, early 1900s. But what do we have here? We have Monet painting a bridge, Le Pont du Chemin de Fer d'Argentine. And it's a coal-fired, he's actually probably whitewashing the exhaust from this, as we would say. That should be black smoke, because that's a coal-fired locomotive. Van Gogh, there's a story behind this version of his famous La Nuit Étoilée, Starry Night. He made various versions of this, and in this one, he wrote a letter to his brother and talked about how he tried to show the light from the gas lamps that lit this harbor versus the stars, trying to show the unique character of that light. Well, these are gas lamps probably made from gas that came from steam treatment of coal. We would call it town gas. And then this poster is talking about basically butano that you could get to run your lamps or other lighting fixtures in your home. So fossil energy is on display at the Musée d'Orsay, if you pay attention. So historically, we've used a lot of coal in the 1800s and well into the 1900s. Up until the 1950s, one of the most powerful companies in America was the Pennsylvania Railroad. Has anyone in the room ever heard of the Pennsylvania Railroad? No, things change. And as I was digging through information for this book chapter, I came across a book that was surveying engine technologies of the time. First edition was in 1906. The edition I was able to get a copy of, the University of Michigan subscribes to lots of services. It's a wonderful tool for us. This later book was from 1913. And they're surveying the rising amount of oil being produced, of petroleum being produced, and comparing it with coal. And they come to this astounding conclusion, 1913. The world must mainly depend on coal for its motive power, whether it's in steam or gas engines. In 1913, this person, an expert in the field, could not see that soon petroleum would displace coal. Petroleum would begin to be used in locomotives by the 1940s, led in part by General Motors and Charles Kettering, the famous inventor and engineer who spent a lot of time in my hometown of Dayton, Ohio, so we're proud of Charles Kettering. But this gives us a very valuable perspective. Once we were all in on coal, and we're hardly doing things with coal today, despite the claims of our current president. Coal is not a beautiful fuel. It's a rather dirty fuel. Okay, so crazy question, crazy answer. Of course, oil supplanted petroleum. But then we get to the scale of the problem. Remember, 233 billion gallons of fuel. Let's start on this side of this slide. So this is a slide from one of my favorite DOE scientists. They've long since retired, Jim Eberhart. He was one of these people that would speak truth to power. He gave some very bold talks back in 2000, 2001, 2002 about our future with fuel. And I love this graphic, although it's scary. So in 2023, we consumed 93.6 quadrillion BTUs. And the quad is 10 to the 15th BTUs. BTU is a small amount of energy. And one quad is a set of rail cars full of oil that stretches from Seattle to Miami. So go back and forth 94 times. That's how much energy we use in the United States. When I first started my academic career in 1994, the number which sticks in my head to this day is Americans are 5% of the world's population, and in 1994, we were consuming about 25% of the world's energy. That has changed a lot with economic development in other parts of the world, but energy use scales directly with per capita income and global gross national product. Though we and many other countries have gotten a lot more efficient, we were consuming something like, I think in the high 70s. Well, in 1997, we consumed 91 quads. So in all this time, it has only increased by a couple of quads. How is that possible? More efficient cars, better lights, more efficient home heating systems and building heating and cooling systems. So we can make progress, a lot of progress, and there's still lots of engineering to be done. Okay, so can we make this transition? We made the transition from coal to petroleum. We've been in the age of petroleum for decades. Well, it's instructive to look back at a few other aspects of the transitions that have happened in transportation. So the horse and buggy, well, by 1920, cars had overtaken horses as the primary mode of personal transportation in the United States. There's still horses. I've got friends that have horse farms, love horses, but we don't need to move around on them and deal with their refuse that they leave in the road. The entire US interstate highway system. The US, places like Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco, well, less San Francisco, covered with highways. And that all came to be in just 35 years, that whole system. So I was talking with some friends at breakfast who had driven on Route 66. My parents did that for their honeymoon. Drove in a convertible Corvette, 1958 Corvette, along Route 66 for their honeymoon. The highways, the interstate highway, the faster system, mostly replaced those regional and national roadways, but many of them still exist, Route 66 being probably the most famous one of them. But that system was a major undertaking. It took not very long. And another one that deals with ports and other challenges that create a lot of air pollution and consume a lot of energy is we moved to standardized containers. I didn't realize that this was a big thing, but this made the transport of goods much more efficient. Having standardized containers, think of the container ships that we see moving across the ocean and being delivered and handled and filled and emptied at ports. That was another technology advance that took just 30 years. So we can make big changes when we need to. Right, so where I am at the University of Michigan, I serve as director of the Walter E. Lay Auto Lab. It's also kind of a piece of history. The building was built in 1957. When the building was created, this plaque was put up to commemorate all the gifts from various companies that had contributed to filling out the equipment in the auto lab. There's one remaining dyno that we're going to get rid of in a couple of months that has a little plaque, gift of Ford Motor Company, 1956. And many of the companies on this list no longer exist. Pontiac, Oldsmobile, those are General Motors automobile brands that went away. Others reconfigured, but we're still going. And we're focused on not only engines and fuels, combustibili e motori, my area, but we have a growing area of work in batteries, whether that's for hybrid vehicles or full battery electric vehicles. So we're trying to prepare for this transition At U of M, we have 17 engine test cells. It's the largest, best equipped university engine lab in the country, in the United States. But 3 of these are going to be turned over to study battery thermal management. 1 for the electric motor, 1 for the battery management system, and 1 for a full-size battery. So we're bending with the wind. Kind of like sometimes if you like American football or even in soccer, football, you know, a defense will give a bit of space, let the other team have the ball, and then they'll go and beat them in a fast break the other way. We're doing that here. Engines still matter. The engines aren't the problem, it's the fuels that we feed them. But we also need electrification, as I'll explain here in a minute. We need a bit of both. Now, how can we quickly decarbonize? Well, it's listening to me again. How can we quickly decarbonize? Well, we did an experiment. This started on the day the campus shut down for the pandemic, March 18th, 2020. I received this vehicle from General Motors, and we drove it for 2 years, on 1 year on diesel fuel to get a baseline, and then a second year on 100% renewable diesel fuel. And what we were able to show is that overnight, we could reduce our carbon footprint by 87%. The remaining carbon footprint was just 13% versus a 2005 Chevy Cavalier running on gasoline, an equivalent car. I've been using President Obama's target, which was to reduce our carbon emissions by 83% versus the 2005 baseline. And that is a faster reduction than you could get in a Chevy Volt. And this is data from my Chevy Volt using electricity carbon intensity from 2020. So I had a Volt for 2 years. So I have a lot of data from it. I use it as a kind of living laboratory. And with electricity in 2020, I could only reduce the carbon footprint versus the baseline by 79%. We can go deeper in carbon reduction faster with renewable fuels, certain renewable fuels, than we can with electricity. It would take until 2050 to reach the equivalent carbon footprint reduction based on the expected trend in carbon intensity of electricity production across the US. So this is based on the US average. A lot of our electricity is produced with natural gas. Growing amount is wind and solar. We had a great talk yesterday about the potential in Mexico for lots of solar power. There's a great potential across the United States. But we still have a lot of fossil energy in our electricity production. So we need renewable fuels, but we will inevitably also need to electrify. But on campus, we've managed to do a couple of different demonstrations on renewable fuel, not only the Chevy Cruze that I drove, but we did work with the trash truck, we did work with the bus. No problems whatsoever. Our transportation and waste management services groups were both really helpful, and we showed them this is easy to do. Unfortunately, the challenge is finding the fuel. That's going to be a challenge for quite some time to come. But these kinds of fuels managed well can go right into the existing system and give you deep carbon footprint reductions. And our logistics system on campus handled them well. I got to do a sabbatical in España in the fall of 2023. I did some team teaching with my colleague Lara and Anton, and then there's Arturo with us. And we hatched a plan to fulfill my research vision for that stay at the Escuela Naval. I wanted to help sea pathways to decarbonize Spanish maritime activities and the Spanish Armada. And here's a training vessel the students go out in. You can see Galicia is often rainy in the fall. It rained for 6 weeks every day for part of the time I was there. The rest of the time it was beautiful. The beaches are beautiful. The people are so friendly, and the seafood is fantastic. But we got to ride on this boat, and one of their 6 ships ran for 2 semesters this past academic year, went through 10,000 liters of renewable diesel donated by Repsol, no problems. And my hope with this was that we would show an entire group of future leaders of the Spanish Armada that being green, running on low carbon fuels will not interfere with your readiness for whatever missions you need to do. And these will be the future leaders of the Spanish Navy. Now, the transition with renewable fuel, renewable diesel in particular, is also very active. So we have this growth in production. We have acceptance of this fuel by companies like Caterpillar and Cummins. And in fact, in Cummins' press release from fall of 2022, they say this stuff is fantastic. It reduces by an additional 13% NOx emissions. Because of that, you need less diesel exhaust fluid to combat NOx. Right off the bat, out of the engine, you get 50% less particulate. So that's going to mean that there's less soot building up in your DPF. And so Cummins fully supports, if you have one of their off-road utility engines, run it on renewable diesel. It just has to meet the diesel fuel specifications. So what do we do? How do we move forward? Well, this is from a very interesting paper in Fuel. This is from a group that includes Renewable Energy Group, which is now part of Chevron. So, you know, when you read something, you need to look at what platform is the writer standing on. Well, these are people who make renewable fuel, so obviously they're going to be telling you you should use renewable fuel, but their analysis is very interesting. They considered if we stay on our path of using petroleum-derived fuels, and we compare that with a path of going to biomass-based diesel fuel, or if we go to a path of using battery electric trucks, or if we use a two-pronged approach, let's electrify where it makes sense, and let's ramp up the use of renewable fuels, so biomass-based diesel and battery electric, we end up reducing the cost of the carbon emissions that we're emitting by 75% versus business as usual, continuing to run on fossil fuel. Could we advance one slide? Yeah, there we go, thanks. 75% reduction. The message is, yes, we need to electrify because we can't cover all the petroleum fuel that we need to displace with renewable fuels alone. We're gonna have to electrify passenger cars, but those don't have to be battery electric cars. They can be cars with smaller batteries, creating less demand for critical materials, and still get you around in a way that is convenient and fun. So one possible branch of doing things is to run diesel engines on ethanol, which might sound crazy, but there's a lot of different groups in the US who've been working on this, including my most recent graduate, Dr. Joe Traska, to put ethanol as one option into your diesel engine. So if we don't have enough renewable diesel for our trucks, and we have fewer cars on the road, we're gonna need less ethanol in our gasoline. What do we do with all that ethanol production? Well, we could turn the ethanol into other fuels, but we could potentially use that ethanol in trucks. Scania did this 20 years ago with a very high compression ratio, and Clearflame, where my student Joe did an internship, uses intake charge heating, and they take out the intercooler and the EGR cooler to raise the cylinder temperature. If I want to make ethanol burn like a diesel fuel, I can, but I got to get it hot as well as pressurize the cylinder. And Joe's idea was to use exhaust rebreathing. Keep the intake valve and the exhaust valve open together a little while and draw in back some of the exhaust. Simple technique. All it would take is a different camshaft. And what he was able to show, we'll need to advance through a couple here, is by selecting an optimal exhaust rebreathing, exhaust valve strategy. This is on an engine that has a fully variable valve timing system. And paying attention to how much back pressure you have in exhaust, you can make the necessary amount of exhaust go back into the intake and be part of that next charge. And to jump to the conclusion, let's go one more slide. Here we go. Well, here's how we did it. We have this variable valve timing system, and he was able to operate with this one particular valve timing strategy. We called that exhaust rebreathing 90 because we closed the valve at 90 degrees. And that gave us plenty of heat in the cylinder to make this engine run on neat ethanol. with a little bit of lubricity agent. And the conclusions from that study were quite promising. Joe was able to make the engine operate at idle and at full load on ethanol, pure ethanol. No extra heating, just changing the valve timing strategy and optimizing the injection strategy. Others are working on this in very clever ways. This was a simple approach, and there's some very good science in this, looking at how we might use pilot injections to help ignite that ethanol. But another example of things that we can do that are practical and things we can do today. This could be done in a Volvo or a Peterbilt or other brand of truck relatively easily. So to summarize, engines remain a focus for us at Michigan. We are doing work in electrification, but we have some new engines that have just come to the lab for work on renewable lubricants and fuels. In this particular case, a new engine from Isuzu that's running this morning, I hope, because we need to generate some data for one of our sponsors. It's a collaboration with a group that's in Costa Rica, Guatemala, and Honduras, who can take waste plastics and turn them into polyalpha olefins for making advanced lubricants, and also they're making biofuel, and we're working on that with them. And new areas that we may grow into, well, we already are doing some work in hydrogen, and we're looking to hire a new faculty member who is fascinated with ammonia, a potential marine or locomotive fuel that has zero carbon and can be made with a very low carbon footprint. So, the bottom line, we have solutions to this greenhouse gas problem. What I see is we can cover a third of our transportation fuel energy with biofuel. A third could be displaced through electrification. The other third, probably for some time to come, is going to still be petroleum. But that's the third we can work on by advancing hydrogen, ammonia, and other synthetic fuels. Those will take a while to ramp up, but they will be useful. And for the students, once you have these slides later, I suggest clicking on this link. I've not found a link other than on LinkedIn to play this video, but I show this in class. It's a fantastic little bit by Neste Oil. Again, they're a biofuel producer, so you have to think, okay, what platform are these people standing on? But it makes a fantastic argument for the need to roll out renewable fuel while we try and electrify, because we will not meet our carbon emissions reduction targets through just electrification. All right, with that, I thank you for your attention. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Robert. Your presentation was very informative. Okay, and tenemos tiempo para varias preguntas. Por favor, si pueden seguir estas preguntas en español.
Yeah. Well, that is a strategy that it's been used in research, particularly in HCCI engines historically. That's one of the EGR. It's sort of semi-internal, semi-external EGR. You've let the exhaust go into the exhaust manifold, move over here, exhaust manifold, and then you're going to bring it back in. That certainly can work. What we would do, and I'm planning to do this fall, is we're going to get a special camshaft cut and go back to the original cylinder head on this engine and demonstrate it with just a part. So you could go get a new camshaft cut. The lobe for the exhaust valves will look different than a traditional exhaust valve lobe, you know, that has this kind of Gaussian shape. It'll have a different shape to hold that exhaust valve open a little longer, but that's the only difference, apart from then calibrating for a better injection strategy adapted for ethanol. So I could see this being something that one could do if there was enough market pull to find ways to use ethanol in trucks. And where that might happen would be in agricultural areas where there's already the ethanol from the corn to ethanol plants. One of our sponsors has been the Indiana Corn Marketing Council. They want to find markets for corn grown in Indiana and for the ethanol that can be made from that corn. And we've done some projects with them and colleagues in Sevilla and elsewhere at University of Castilla-La Mancha to turn that ethanol into higher alcohols. But you could make the same argument that you have this ethanol, it's in storage in those rural areas. And so trucks that are going around carrying ammonia or other things to the farmers could potentially run on that ethanol that's readily available. This, I think, could be done. It might be something you would do as an aftermarket adaptation of the engine, but we'll have to see if any of the truck manufacturers have interest. Clearflame, sadly, has gone out of business, so they did not make it, but a lot of startups don't make it. A question up here from Jose and John Romero. So using hydrogen in internal combustion engines, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so one could make the argument that hydrogen is best used in a fuel cell, but the fuel cell platform is expensive. The hydrogen itself right now is very expensive, so it's hard to make a case to use hydrogen in anything other than where it's used now. Where we make most of our hydrogen is from natural gas. One of the big users in the Metro Detroit area in Michigan would be our refinery. Marathon operates a refinery just south of Detroit. They use an incredible amount of hydrogen, but they're doing methane steam reforming. They don't want to add a new system. But if we could give them green hydrogen or pink hydrogen made from nuclear power, there's also 20 miles down the road a nuclear power plant, so that electricity could be used to make green, low carbon intensity hydrogen, and that could go to the refinery. They would use more than we could use for decades in a fleet of trucks. The argument for hydrogen and IC engines is made very well by folks who work on managing the transportation system in the city of Detroit. So I'll borrow from Tim Slusser from the Transportation Innovation Office. His concern is the electricity grid in Detroit is not very strong. There's not enough electricity for the commercial trucks that move in Detroit and around Detroit, in and out of Detroit, to run on electricity and be charged in the city of Detroit. That's just not possible. But they have air quality problems in Detroit because of all the truck traffic. So the manager for transportation in the city of Detroit looks at hydrogen, whether it's a fuel cell or an IC engine, as very good solutions long-term for city of Detroit, because it addresses the air quality problem, because those engines can be very, very clean, as recently shown at Southwest Research Institute in a demonstration truck that got to 0.008 grams of NOx per horsepower hour. That's way beyond the low NOx standard that California and the federal government have proposed. So it can be a great option. Any application of hydrogen, though, is going to be challenged by the fact that it's very expensive. Oh, take a second.
This is not a really question. For me, it's one of the best of that I have. Because I need work stop history of the mobility problem.
My pleasure. Thanks again to the organizers for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, doctor.